Okay, we've come to the finale of this series. This is the fifth in our 5 Wednesdays in May lecture series on the history of radical political, social movements in Ireland. The series has been organised by Occupy University, Dublin Community Television and the Ireland Institute. I'm Helena Sheehan. I'm a professor at DCU and organiser for Occupy University. Tonight we're going to be looking at first wave feminism, which is another aspect of what I might call the hidden history of Ireland. And to guide us through this, we have Mary Cullen, who's a very eminent feminist historian. She's a real pioneer in the area of women's history. She's taught for many years in the history department of the National University of Ireland at Maynooth. She's the author of many publications on women's history. And to honour her pioneering role in this area, she was recently awarded an honorary doctorate from Maynooth. She's also currently connected with the Trinity College Centre for Women's Studies. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you. Well, the first wave of the international women's movement started around 1840. And in every country, from Ireland, pretty well every country across to European Russia, and in the English-speaking world overseas, that's in North America, Australasia, groups of women, pretty small for the most part, began to come together to challenge the laws in various areas. And it's very interesting that even though laws, customs and regulations are not the same in all countries, obviously, yet the gender relations between men and women were so similar that people saw themselves and understood themselves to be part of a women's movement. And they spoke of that, and they were interested in what was going on in other countries. And in broad terms, you can say, if you look at the situation in Ireland, where Ireland at this stage was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the situation here was somewhat similar to what it was in other countries. And broadly, you could say, just taking it under the common law in Great Britain and Ireland, and the common law operated here then, marriage was a very, very central issue. When a man and a woman got married, under the common law, they merged into one person, and that person was the man. And the man had complete control over his wife's inherited or earned property, could do anything with it. He had complete control of the family, where they lived, what they did. He was the sole guardian of their children. She only became a guardian after his death if he actually, willed that it was so. Divorce was much more difficult for a woman to obtain than a man. Then in the area of education, universities and higher education were the exclusive domain of men. Women were not allowed into those and into degrees and the higher professions. In sexual double standards across the board, offences related to sex that the law saw as punishable, as things like adultery, prostitution, births outside marriage, the general pattern was that women were the guilty and the punishable party. And then in the public political sphere, again, the pattern is very universal across the board, with some exceptions like a reigning monarch, and Queen Victoria was on the throne for a great deal of this time. All public offices were otherwise closed to women. They hadn't got the vote in parliamentary elections, they couldn't be elected to parliament. Turning it around the other way, you could say that men were a very, very privileged sex in society generally. Now, why did the movement start at this period? People see there has always been feminist resistance and feminist complaints. I mean, you wouldn't have, for instance, Aristotle explaining that women are not citizens because they're not rational, and they're not rational because the actual texture of their brain is different. You wouldn't have people explaining things unless there was somebody was saying it's a bit different. But why did we have organised resistance at this time? Well, historians see the origins of the movement in both economic and intellectual origins. First of all, there's the economic. And now we're talking about the late 18th, early 19th century, which is the background to all of this. The Industrial Revolution starting in England and spreading elsewhere. What that actually leads to in terms of social class is the huge expansion of the middle classes. That is in the professions, in commerce, in banking, across the board, in trade and commerce, in all sorts of areas. Now, the middle classes grow in numbers and in wealth. And what actually happens, and you can see it happening if you watch what in Great Britain and Ireland, that middle class men begin to move into political life and into political power. And the middle class women are increasingly left behind. And in fact, their area actually contracts, because before that, and again, we haven't time to go into it, it's very interesting to look at the census reports. Most occupations were usually had a husband who might own the bakery or the butcher's or the doctor, whatever it was. But the wife would pretty well always be a partner in that. She'd be helping to run things, running the books, looking after apprentices and so on. As the middle classes get richer and you begin to have suburban living, you can see it here in Dublin as middle classes begin to move out to the suburbs, the workplace and the home are separated. And again, the middle class woman's area of operation contracts. So that's one reason that historians, and it's undoubtedly one. But then there is the intellectual background, and that is the Enlightenment of the late 18th century. The Enlightenment enthused by building really on the discoveries of the scientific revolution and their success by observation and reason, discovering the laws of the natural world. Intellectual Europe began to apply that to human societies, and there's a tremendous enthusiasm that human reason and observation could discover the laws of human nature and human societies, and you didn't have to appeal to the Bible or the church or whoever the ruling authority was, that human beings could do it for themselves. And that impacted upon the idea of citizenship. At this period, the idea of republican citizenship was very, very, very strong. But this now gave a powerful influence of equality and egalitarianism to that, because if reason was so important, every human being, by nature of being born, shared rational human nature. So this immediately began to expand the idea of who was eligible for citizenship. Now, admittedly, very few of the male intellectual thinkers, there were a few exceptions, applied that to women. But some of our pioneering women did, and you begin to have, we won't have to go into that, but people like Mary Wollstonecraft in England, some of the women of the United Irishmen in Ireland, and others, and of course the women of the French Revolution, the citizens, and they began to apply that to women. But it's not until we get to around 1840 that you begin to get groups of middle-class women, largely, coming together in small organised groups to actually campaign to change the law in all these areas. And just one thing that is very important to remember there, that an unexpected help that they had in that was in religion in a strange way, and that is in evangelical religion or revivalism, which starts again in the late 18th century through the impact first of Enlightenment thinking and egalitarianism on the established church in England in the first instance. And it really started a movement that wanted to get back to individual human Christian living. It spread across all denominations, getting away from kind of arid reasoning and living a Christian life. And women were recognised by the evangelical leadership as having a role in this, because if you're looking at a good family life, a moral family life, a good community life, living the life of Christians, not looking for esteem, being self-effacing, thinking of others. These were virtues that were usually associated with women. And it gave women, interestingly, a kind of a mandate. And it's quite amazing, in the late 18th and early 19th century, in Ireland as well as elsewhere, really, really large numbers of middle-class women and upper-class women begin to move outside the home into philanthropic activities. They begin doing things like organising Sunday schools, visiting women in prisons, setting up refuges for prostitutes and women who are ex-prisoners, going on, as many of them to found things like hospitals. It's an amazing movement. And from the philanthropy, this brought many, many women into contact with the public world, which women, of course, weren't supposed to have anything to do with, and it allowed them to see that it really wasn't as wonderful as men said, and that women could do some things themselves, perhaps even better. And it's from the ranks of the women who are moved into philanthropic activity that are first pioneering feminists. They all seem to be drawn from that. Now, in Ireland, action, we find, begins around 1860. And in Ireland, there are 4 during the 19th century main campaigns. There are small groups of women, but one of the campaigns is married women's property. That is changing the law so that married women will have control of their own property. We'll come back to the importance of that. Another one was raising the standards in education, in female education. Another was tackling one instance of the sexual double standards. That was the Contagious Diseases Acts, which were passed in the 1860s in the United Kingdom. They applied to designated areas where the Army and the Navy were stationed, and the idea was that after the Crimean War, and the huge deaths of young soldiers there and the state of their health, dying in hospital rather than on the battlefield, the authorities were horrified and were looking to improve their health. And one of the ways they thought of doing that was to cut down on the incidence of venereal disease, which so many soldiers and sailors suffered from. And the way they thought of doing that, of course, was tackling the women, not the men. And the Contagious Diseases Act allowed a police officer of a certain rank in the designated areas to arrest a woman if he thought she was suspected she might be a prostitute. She would go for compulsory medical examination. If she was found to be suffering from venereal disease, she would go for compulsory treatment in a lock hospital, and then if she was okay, she could go back to being a prostitute. And then finally, there was a campaign to get the vote, parliamentary vote, upon the same terms as men. Now, all these campaigns interact with each other, and they add up to really a claim to be full human beings and full citizens. Married women's property is very, very important, because actually the campaign is going on in England at this time too for custody of children. That starts from about 1837, for divorce, more even, if you like, provisions about divorce. Married women's property is the area that the Irish women get involved in. In this one, they were working very closely, and I'll explain why in a minute, with their English counterparts. And married women's property, if a woman married, and if her husband has complete control over her property, now that is whether she's working in a linen mill in Belfast, and the feminists were very concerned about the poorer women in particular, or if she was writing novels around her out in Killiney or somewhere in Dublin, any money that she earned, apart from property that she inherited, her husband had legally complete control of that. He didn't have to, but he could take it, he could give it away, he could bequeath it. Well, you all know the pursuit of the ARS, and it was taken for granted that men, established businesses on their wives' dowries. But that had spread beyond, because what do you do? If all girls and all young women aim to get married, and most of them perhaps would, how does that impact on other things? It impacts straight away upon education, because if a family, if you're, say, your middle-class daughter, if she's being educated, and if you know that any property that you give her or that she earns herself is going to go straight under her husband's control, it gives a great incentive that middle-class education aims more at what people called accomplishment-level education, rather than the kind of training for a serious mental development and for employment and universities and so on, that was seen as appropriate if it worked out in practice for their brothers. And it was aimed more at accomplishment level education, which enables you to make as advantageous a match as possible. And then, allied to the fact that the universities were the domain of men, they were closed to women, that of course added into that too. There wasn't much point in doing that. So improving the idea of the education of women, it interacted with married women's property. It interacts with all of these things. Now, the Irish activists, we'll come to what they actually did in a minute, the Irish activists who emerged, we see action from around, we see it in the 1860s. They were very small in number. Many of the organisations had only, say, 40 or 50 members. They were pretty well all middle class, and as far as we know, certainly all the leaders, they seem to have been Protestant women and women who were unionist in politics. And this is the case up till pretty well the end of the 19th century. It changes then. And the reasons for that are many. For one thing, Ireland is part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. First of all, Irish women and English women throughout Great Britain, they share more or less the same legal disabilities. There can be slight differences here and there, but they do, and under the common law, they share the same kind of marriage situation. And then they're all looking for, if you want to get legislation, and most of these things needed legislation passed by an all-male parliament at Westminster, you're aiming at the same parliament. So there's a tremendous reason, obvious reason, for all kind of working together. Now that brings, of course, women who have a unionist perspective, women who see more of affiliation with their sisters in England, they're going to find that much more easy. Now, as nationalism is developing during the 19th century, all sorts of things operate. Religion perhaps is one factor, but that is probably more important. Nationalist women during the 19th century in Ireland, Protestant and Catholic, they're not apolitical. They're actually involved right through, that they don't get much notice for it in the books. They're involved in everything from Catholic emancipation, they're involved in the repeal campaign, they're involved in the Fenians, they're involved in the Land League, not only in the Ladies' Land League, in the Land League even before that, they're involved in the Home Rule movement. They are involved politically, and of course at the level of poorer women, they're always to the fore with their men in community action. You only have to look at the pictures of evictions during the Land War to see that kind of thing. So it's not that they're apolitical, but that for nationalists, you see, in the situation in Great Britain, there are two things operating. One, if you're looking to the Parliament for redress, the United Kingdom Parliament, the more and more you get to Home Rule, the question comes in, do we wait until we have an Irish Parliament? Are we giving legitimacy? And then secondly, if the feminism can seem, and feminism isn't the right word at this stage, it's women's rights, women's activism. Feminism in the sense we use it today only came into use at the end of the 19th century. But it seemed to be an English importation to many. So there are various reasons there. But it is very, very interesting that this is the case there. Two of the main names, I just mentioned them, who are in all the campaigns for everything, for married women's property, to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts, for education reform, for parliamentary vote, are Anna Haslam, who was born in Youghal in a Quaker family, and Isabella Todd, who was born in Edinburgh but who lived in Belfast and was a Presbyterian. But in the cases of married women's property and the campaign to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts, the Irish women worked largely as part of, affiliates or committees linked to the English movement. In the areas of education and the parliamentary vote, things are a bit different because of the Irish situation. Now, the way these groups acted, first of all, if you're aiming at changing at Parliament, as you are in many cases, at getting legislation passed, they're aiming at educating public opinion by writing letters to the papers, by holding meetings. Drawing room meetings are one thing where you have it in somebody who has a big drawing room, well off, and you get all the influential people, men and women you can there, and you get a speaker. And then public meetings open to everybody when you have some well-known speaker to come. Lobbying of members of Parliament, that's terribly important. How are you ever going to get an amendment to a bill or a new private member's bill introduced if you don't have some male parliamentarians to do it? So that is going on all the time, and right through the women are very grateful to the male politicians who do support them. Largely the men who take the initiative in introducing amendments and bills are, as we might expect, liberal politicians, but it's very, very interesting to watch the results, and the English Women's Review watches every bit of legislation, whether it's passed or not, all the voting. The Irish Home Rule MPs, right through from the time the Home Rule movement emerges around in the 1870s, they had a very, very good record, percentage-wise, of their votes on all the kind of women's issues. It's a very, very interesting area. And Now, we don't know very much about the actual activities, except we know that they organised petitions on the married women's property. And in married women's property, the first Married Women's Property Act was passed in 1870, which in the way of most legislation within the United Kingdom, from everything from representation of the people, it gives things bit by bit. It began to give very limited control of married women over their property. But bit by bit, over the acts, right up to, I suppose, in 1907, the complete separation of spouses and their property is actually established. The Contagious Diseases Acts we know a bit more about what happened there, even though they were very much linked. It's very interesting there. There was a very strong movement throughout the United Kingdom to repeal the Contagious Diseases Acts. Now, one basis of complaint was that by doing this, by regulating prostitution in any way, that is by dealing with the prostitutes and sending them to hospital, the government was actually in some way legitimising prostitution. So that was one thing. But the feminists then had another angle, that it was an anti-woman thing. And Josephine Butler, the great leader of the social purity campaign and the campaign against the acts, when she gave evidence before a commission of inquiry into how the acts were operating, she was very, very blunt. She told the commission that what these acts were doing, that they were recycling the women as clean harlots for the army and navy. She said that to the committee. Oh, these women, they're so radical and outspoken. We can learn so much from them. And speaking, there are two main committees. One, there was a large mixed sex, and this is in Ireland as well as in England. There were branches of them were set up here, is you had a mixed-sex committee where men and women worked together. But because speaking about these issues, you know, see, Victorian women in this period, they weren't supposed to be knowing much about sex at all, let alone about venereal disease and prostitution, and worse still, making public speeches about them. It was pretty embarrassing for some women. So there was a Ladies' National Association as well. And I love it when I discovered that Anna Haslam, who's in many ways is my heroine, she was in Dublin, she was secretary, I think, of the Mixed Sex Committee and treasurer of the women's one. You know, she was in both at the same time. Wonderful. But just to give you an idea of what they were doing and how, they, in 1878, they invited Josephine Butler again over to speak, and they had a public meeting in the Rotunda where many public meetings were held. And as you could understand, the medical students from the Rotunda came in to the hall and they sat at the back and they heckled and they shouted and they said, "Get those women off the platform," and they kind of disrupted the meeting. I have to say that the Irish medical profession, actually, if we come back, we haven't time to go into it, it's a pretty good record on women's issues. But the meeting had to be abandoned. And Anna Haslam told Frances G. Skeffington later in an interview in the Irish Citizen that what happened was that Josephine Butler wanted to go back to England, but the Haslams, her husband Thomas was he was an equally committed feminist. They organised another meeting, I think in Molesworth Street somewhere, and she said that many of the former hecklers, the students, came and were converted to the cause. But what they were doing was absolutely amazing. The Contagious Diseases Acts were eventually repealed. I think it was in 1886, I think. But of course, during the First World War and many other times, similar acts were introduced again. Then on education, now on education, what the women were doing, they were, you know, themselves, many of them were trying to help poorer women to be educated. Though mind you, in the national system, the numbers of girls and boys was, you know, not too different at all. It was doing quite well. But what they wanted to do was to up the level of middle-class women's education. Partly for its own sake, for self-development as human beings, but also because if women wanted to take their share in society and help, they needed to develop their potential. Now, how were they going to do that? So they set out to try to raise the level of the teaching, that is, teachers in girls' schools and governesses who might be in girls' homes. And they actually began to set up colleges. You have Victoria College in Belfast, which starts in 1859, Alexandra College in Dublin in 1866. And these are set up, and when you see the word college, you see that the women are trying to establish an education that is approaching university standard. The women aren't, of course, allowed into the universities. They're doing this. It's also very interesting that to up their teaching, who is going to teach in these colleges? Many of them, both in Belfast and in Dublin, professors, male professors, and maybe graduate students from the men's colleges helped out. There was very strong cooperation between Trinity Dons and Alexandra College, for example. Though it's very interesting that Alexandra College found that the level of the young women who came into the college when it opened in 1866 was so poor that they went on to set up Alexandra High School in the 70s to try to improve that kind of education. Again, we haven't time to go into it all. But the feminists made a tremendous breakthrough in education in about two pieces of legislation. One was the Intermediate Education Act of 1878, and the second was the Irish University Act of 1879, under which the Royal University was established. Now, both of these had nothing to do with women's education. They were really, I suppose, politically motivated things. In the Irish situation, as you can imagine, the educational system for men and for boys was, if you like, weighted towards Protestants through endowments and so on. And now, at this stage, we're in the late 1870s, the government is very anxious to, if you like, I suppose it's the beginning of the policy of killing home rule with kindness, to wean Catholic Ireland and Mail away from support from home rule. And the grievance about education is one very real one.